You're listening to the OCD Stories podcast, hosted by me, Stuart Ralph. The OCD Stories is a podcast dedicated to raising awareness and understanding around obsessive compulsive symptoms. I do this through interviewing inspired therapists, psychologists, and people who have experienced OCD. Welcome to the OCD Stories. And welcome to episode 329. And in this one, I interview Maya Tadross, and Maya has kindly agreed to share her story with us. And in particular, we talk about her being in residential treatment, her experiences of exposure and response prevention therapy, managing OCD alongside studying, living by her values. We talk about perfectionism, OCD symptoms changing form, her well-being priorities, getting an ADHD diagnosis later in life, her experience of ADHD and how OCD masked it for her, and much, much more. And thank you to NoCD for supporting the podcast. NoCD offers affordable, effective, and convenient therapy available in the US and outside the US. To find out more about NoCD, their therapy plans, if they currently take your insurance, or to download their free app, head over to go.treatmyocd.com/the OCD stories, or the link will be in the episode description. And of course, thank you as always to you guys for listening. I deeply appreciate it. And without further ado, here is Maya. Welcome to the show, Maya.
Thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have you on. And as you know, I want to hear your OCD story, and you can share that in as little or as much detail as you want to give.
Okay, yeah. So I've always been an anxious child, but around the time I turned 14, the summer before high school started, I started getting these thoughts that I couldn't shake out of my head. They were about germs and dirt, whether or not I had been a bad person, if I had checked things like light switches, the stove, locks, and things like that. And I started doing these repetitive behaviors, and I didn't know what was going on. I was washing my hands so much more than usual. My showers got longer because I was afraid that if I didn't do them in a certain way, something bad would happen. And I started checking all of these things, checking locks especially. I would check every single lock in my house, which took a very long time. And if I didn't check it as my brain said correctly, then I would have to check it again, which just took a lot of time. And then once high school started, I had these obsessions about, was I getting enough information out of my coursework? Was I understanding things properly? So I would start rereading and rewriting, and it just took so much more time to complete homework assignments than it needed to. And at night, I would pray excessively for hours and have these elaborate checking and redoing and undoing, counting, verbal ritual compulsions that would take hours. So I was going to bed really late and waking up really early. I wasn't getting enough sleep, which of course reinforced the obsessions because I didn't have the energy to fight them. And when I was still 14, I realized there was something wrong. I didn't know what was going on. So I consulted the internet of all places because I guess that's what 14-year-olds do. And I started Googling my symptoms, and I found this thing called OCD. And I was like, oh, this makes a lot of sense. This, I think, is what I have. And there's treatment for it. So I wrote a letter to my parents because I was afraid to go to them directly, and told them, I think I have this thing called OCD. And they responded pretty well. They were a little shocked at first, as any parent probably would be. But they took me to my general pediatrician, and the pediatrician referred me to a general therapist, a general talk therapist, who unfortunately didn't help very much because it was just talk therapy. That we weren't really doing the right therapy for OCD. But through that therapist, I was referred to a research study at Columbia University in New York City, where they were offering free CBT and ERP if you would get your brain scanned, pretty much. So I had an fMRI, a functional MRI, before and after, I think, 16 weeks of exposure and response prevention therapy to see if my brain changed at all during that time. And unfortunately, my OCD was so severe that once a week ERP wasn't enough, but I was able to learn what ERP was and that it was the right treatment for OCD. So that was really helpful. Then I believe after the study, I had a local ERP therapist, but then again, once a week wasn't enough. My OCD was getting worse. And around the time I turned 15, 16, the therapists were recommending that I go to a higher level of care. And of course, because I was so young, my parents and I were a bit afraid to send me away to a residential care facility because the only two were in Boston and Wisconsin, and I was based in New York, so those are kind of far away. So I was put on the wait list for both of them with the hope that maybe my OCD would get better and that I wouldn't have to go, but just in case. And once the time came for me to go, my OCD was still really bad. So I went to residential treatment in Wisconsin at Rogers Behavioral Health. And I was there for almost 3 months. And I did intensive exposure and response prevention therapy every single day, as well as group therapy, experiential therapy, which is kind of like, I call it like a glorified gym class. We did like ropes courses and hiking, and we went canoeing, kayaking, caving, and it was all tied to living by our values instead of by fear, which I thought was pretty cool. We also did lots of art therapy, and my favorite was pet therapy, where they brought in dogs because I missed my dog so much. And I think Rogers saved my life because the work I did there really helped decrease the severity of my OCD and made it so much more manageable. But of course, it still wasn't gone, as you can imagine. So after that, I've been seeing the same therapist since then. It's been about 5 years. And I've been working on ERP with her twice a week for the past 4 years, I would say. And then my OCD within the last year has become very manageable, which is a bit scary to say because when OCD is no longer your biggest problem, other things decide to pop up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. So, wow, what a journey. And yeah, the amount of time that's gone into ERP and I guess your dedication to that. In that journey of ERP, have there been times where either at the start or during where you just didn't want to do it, didn't want to, do the homework or whatever it is?
Definitely. I would say I was a bit unconventional in that in the beginning, I was very gung-ho about ERP because I was just so excited to get better. And I remember in my residential treatment, I would joke around and be like, I heart CBT, I heart ERP. But it was true because I really liked it because I could see that it was helping me so much. But the real struggles with ERP came actually after residential treatment when I started tackling the higher elements of my fear hierarchy. Those were very difficult for me. And I spent a lot of time kind of just like mulling over in my head, do I really want to do this? I could just stay stuck in this OCD and stay safe, or I could face these really big, scary fears, but I don't know what will happen if I face these fears. So yeah, I definitely faced a lot of challenges with ERP, especially the years after residential.
Yeah, absolutely. And I like what you said there. Well, I don't know what's going to happen if I face my fears, and that's terrifying.
Yeah.
But the alternative is living with OCD, and that's also terrifying. So
exactly.
Does one of them have an upside? And yes, potentially with ERP. Yeah. So you did art therapy as part of the inpatient treatment.
Yeah.
Yeah. What did you get out of art therapy? Did it help in any way?
Yeah. So I've always been a pretty creative person. I usually do art as a hobby, and I just really liked art therapy because it pretty much it was a whole room full of all of these art supplies, and you could do whatever you wanted with them, which I was like a kid in a candy store. Um, and sometimes they had a prompt. Like I remember once we had to draw a tree, and the roots were our core values, and the branches were, I think, characteristics that we hoped to like live by. I thought that was pretty cool. I remember I used lots of markers, all different colors, to make that tree, and it was really fun. We also did more just like random things, like random crafts, just to kind of take our minds off of things and have fun, which also was just a good time because we were all having a difficult time with our OCD, so we needed a bit of an outlet.
Yeah, absolutely. And do you still have that tree painting now?
I do have it. It's at home, but I'm in college now, so I don't have it with me right this minute, but I do think I still have it. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. And yeah, so, at the start of your story, or around the age of 14, you said you wrote that letter to your parents. And was that it just felt too much to kind of, literally open your mouth and say the words? So writing the letter felt like an easier way to do that?
Yeah, exactly. I always had a hard time with verbal words. I was afraid that I would like trip over myself or say something that wasn't right. That wasn't necessarily an OCD thing. It was just I wasn't always the best verbally when I tried to explain things. So I figured if I wrote it in a letter, I could make it like the most accurate, if that makes sense. I think there definitely was an OCD component now that I'm thinking about it to that, because I do remember rewriting the letter several times because it didn't sound right, or I wasn't sure that it would be taken the right way. So yeah, now that I think about it, there definitely was an OCD component to that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, you're at college now, and I'm sure there's many people listening at college, and I'm sure high school and stuff like that. How are you managing it now, alongside your studies, I guess?
Yeah, that's a good question. In the beginning of college, my OCD was a lot stronger than it is now, especially with intrusive thoughts around harm and contamination and things like that. I'm trying to think. So it was kind of difficult to manage my studies when I had intrusive thoughts about going to class. I also have social anxiety, so that played into it. There was never really like a question to me of whether or not I should go to class. Like it was always live by your values, go to class. But I definitely was anxious to go to class because of intrusive thoughts of harm and some contamination things. But I pretty much just pushed through those. It was difficult, but I think it was almost like a silent struggle. No one really saw it. I didn't even see it until, I guess, now, really. Hindsight is 2020. So yeah. Also, some of my perfectionism sometimes creeps in with assignments, and it's very insidious because I don't even know what's happening because it manifests so much differently now than it used to. It used to be just concrete rereading and rewriting until it looks perfect. But now I find myself getting stuck with assignments sometimes, especially longer writing assignments. And it takes me a while to realize, oh, I think this is my perfectionism creeping in, because it just takes a bit of a different form now. I think a big thing in OCD recovery, at least for me, is OCD starting to take a different form after you've conquered a certain type of it. Like once you've conquered what the perfectionism used to look like, it starts to take a different form because the OCD always tries to creep back in. So trying to catch those different ways that it manifests is a bit difficult, but definitely important.
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know if this is applicable. What came to my head was like an image of like fishing, with the hook, and it's almost like OCD is just changing the bait.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes,
exactly. That's a perfect analogy.
Thank you. So I like that you said when initially you were going to class, and you didn't even until maybe now realize that maybe that was OCD. You just felt anxious, and you were like well, I'm going to do it anyway because my value is to get an education and meet people. And is that kind of how it played out?
I think so. Mostly just because I fear relapse, which I mean, I'm not sure if that's the best motivation to fear relapse over wanting to live by your values, but I was always afraid like if I let this one OCD thing go, then like OCD will take a little and then it'll take a lot like the next time. So it's very easy for OCD to just take over. And I know that. So I try my best to not let it take anything because then it'll just take a lot the next time.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, and it's whatever works for you as an individual. If that drives you and motivates you, then great.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So yeah, with your general well-being now, and that can include OCD. What you mentioned art, but is there anything else you do that just helps you?
A big thing that I do is writing. I have a series of journals because I just keep filling them and going to the next one. And I kind of think of it as the closest thing to therapy that I have besides therapy, because I kind of just write down all my thoughts and feelings. And it helps to get them out on paper. And also, sometimes if I'm a little confused or don't understand something, writing it out and reading it back, I can kind of see more clearly what's going on, which is really helpful. And sometimes the writing, I have a hard time remembering in therapy, as probably a lot of people do, what happened the past week, and just rereading my old journal entries for the past week before therapy, I can remember what I wanted to say in therapy, which just makes things a lot more efficient too.
Yeah, I agree with that. As a therapist, some of my clients will bring in notes occasionally, and that can help because I struggle. Someone asks me, "What do you do at the weekend?" and it's Monday, and I'm like, I have no idea.
Exactly.
Let alone what I've been worrying about or doing. Yeah. Okay. No, that's useful. And at college, as I say, university, at college / university, what how do you find that balance? Because like college itself is overwhelming, can be the
Oh,
amount of
yeah.
the amount of coursework and everything else. But then you've obviously got the socializing element. You've also got you're still in therapy and doing that stuff. How do you find that balance so you don't get too overwhelmed or stressed, and also that you're getting the right amount of sleep?
That's a good question. Yeah, two things I would say I really prioritize are my sleep schedule and eating 3 times a day. And I feel like um, going to bed at the same time and waking up around the same time every day, and then having 3 meals a day around the same time just kind of provides a framework for my schedule. And it really helps because, as a lot of people know, with OCD, if you get off schedule, especially with sleep and eating, it can just make things so much worse so quickly. And I try to schedule my days because I also have ADHD, which I recently was diagnosed with, and I literally will forget things if I don't write them down. So I literally have to write down kind of hour by hour or like segment by segment what I'm going to be doing that day. And it also helps manage my OCD in that having a regular daily schedule just like keeps the OCD out, because if I'm well fed and well rested, it has like less of a ability to, I guess, overwhelm me.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good points. Okay, so and you mentioned ADHD there. So what led to you finally getting a diagnosis for that?
That's a really good question. This is actually a very recent development in my life because I never thought I could have ADHD. It's something I was like, oh, I'm not inattentive, I'm not hyperactive, I'm not impulsive. But it turns out that my OCD had been masking all of that. As a child, I do remember interrupting a lot. I was a bit hyperactive as a child, constantly like doing little things like ripping apart erasers or ripping apart paper, um, fidgeting, but it was all very silent and no one ever really noticed it, including myself. I just thought it was normal. And then once my OCD came around, my OCD sort of masked all of these things because I had moral OCD. Oh, it's inappropriate to interrupt people. So I stopped interrupting people. What else? I was still fidgeting and doing things like that, skin picking, but it was all attributed to OCD. Any inattention I had was attributed to, oh, she's having intrusive thoughts. That's why she can't pay attention. So I think that's a very common thing that happens that a lot of people aren't aware of because OCD and ADHD are very highly comorbid with each other. Especially in girls and women, it's really hard to detect the ADHD because it just presents so differently.
Yeah.
Especially also because my dad and my sister both have ADHD, but it presents so differently in them than it does in me. So I was like, oh, they have ADHD. I can't have it because I'm not like them. But I guess the added OCD makes it a bit different. And so my amazing therapist, when I was 20, so I guess this was less than a year ago, I think last summer, she was like, Maya, do you think that you could possibly have ADHD? Because in my notes, I have it flagged several times, like inattention. She said, I've noticed in session a lot, your inattention. And I used to think it was, oh, anxiety, maybe OCD. But now that your OCD is doing better, you're still inattentive. And I wonder what that piece is. Maybe we should try to rule out ADHD. So I was like, at first, no, of course not. I don't have ADHD. Like, I'm not like my dad and my sister. I'm very different. I just didn't think I could have it. And the more psychoeducation I got on ADHD, especially presenting in women, I was like, wow, this actually does make a lot of sense, especially looking back and seeing how my OCD masked a lot of the executive dysfunction. Like my perfectionism OCD made me reread and rewrite. And looking back, there might have been an ADHD piece with the rereading because I might have actually not understood what I was reading because of ADHD, and then my OCD would make me reread, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
A lot of little things like that. So I went to my psychiatrist I actually went to a new psychiatrist to try to get an evaluation. And it was very difficult actually to get an evaluation for ADHD because unfortunately a lot of the psychiatrists pretty much, they never said this straight out, but they said, well, because you're doing well, they pretty much implied because you have always done well in school, you can't have ADHD, which doesn't make sense because I know that's like a stereotype that you have to struggle in school to have ADHD, but it's definitely not the case. And a lot of them saw it through the lens of my OCD, like, oh, your inattentiveness is because you're having intrusive thoughts. But I was saying, no, I'm not having intrusive thoughts still, and I'm still inattentive and I still can't pay attention. Like, I don't know what's happening. So finally I got an evaluation and it turned out I did have ADHD. Well, I do have ADHD. And I was very surprised, but it honestly accounts for so many of the things that I've experienced. Once my OCD became a lot more manageable, it accounted for a lot of the things that I still struggled with or still do struggle with. So it really made a lot of sense. And finally starting medication for ADHD was life-changing because I was finally able to have like an actual streamlined path of thought. And it just felt so weird, but so good to be able to focus and stay awake almost, because a part of my ADHD was if I was understimulated, I would almost like go into the zone of like kind of falling asleep, but not really. Like it was like my brain fell asleep while I was still awake, if that makes sense. But the medication helped me stay awake and focused, which has been extremely helpful. And I think it also has helped my OCD because just treating one other thing makes one less problem, I guess. So I can focus on the OCD and make that a little less worse too.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing. And I'm glad you got the answer. I don't know if you were looking for it, but the answer you were looking for, if we can say that. And I appreciate that you said about it's underdiagnosed or noticed in women, which is,
Definitely.
yeah, absolutely. Same as autism's the same. It's harder to spot in young girls or older women than it is in boys. But it's worth highlighting that. So you mentioned there, so I guess I want to ask how ADHD impacted therapy, if it did. You did say initially, where your therapist highlighted that your attention maybe wasn't always there.
Yeah.
Was there any other areas you think the ADHD made it harder to do ERP?
I'm trying to think. Um, Thankfully the ADHD piece like was it became visible because my OCD was already so managed that
Mm.
the other symptoms that I was showing that weren't OCD, which were ended up being ADHD, that's how they became apparent. I don't really know if it must have affected ERP. Looking back, I'm trying to remember. Um, Definitely waiting between trials of ERP. I remember being very um, impatient, but I just thought that was normal. And also, I guess some executive dysfunction, planning when to do ERP, especially after residential treatment. Well, in residential treatment, it was like there's a set time, like do your ERP. But once I had to integrate ERP back into my regular life, that was a bit difficult trying to figure out when to do it before I started writing everything down that I needed to do. Planning when to do it was definitely difficult. Now I can look back and see that too.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing and highlighting ADHD. So, what was I going to say? So, yeah. So, any roadblocks to your recovery, and if so, how did you overcome them?
Thankfully, I don't think I've had many major roadblocks, but a bunch of, I would say, small to moderate ones. And that kind of ties back to the question you asked earlier about obstacles in ERP. If I ever was struggling to do ERP, there have been a few exposures that I have been extremely hesitant to do in my life. And I started working on those around December 2019, I think. And I remember the first time I had to do the exposure, I freaked out and threw my phone across the room. I was doing the exposure on my phone. And I usually have more self control than that. But that was definitely difficult. And I think my therapist could see, okay, I think maybe she's not ready for this exposure yet. So we paused that and then we resumed it about a year later, actually. And it actually did become a bit easier after all the work I did in between to work up to it. But it was still very difficult. And I would find myself writing in my journals at night, like pretty much like weighing in my head, do I want to do this? Like, I know that if I don't do this, the OCD wins. But if I do this, like, what does it mean? What bad things could happen? Um, those were definitely some pretty significant, I would say, roadblocks in my recovery. Just pretty much like weighing in my head, do I really want to do this? What could happen if I don't do this? Or what could happen if I do this? And I feel like I'm kind of facing one of those now too with another OCD fear. Even though my OCD is pretty manageable, I still have this one fear that I'm still trying to overcome. And it's just so difficult that I don't even really feel comfortable saying it out loud. And I'm usually a very open person, which is just shows how much of a hold it has over me. And I'm in kind of like a similar spot where I'm like, do I want to do this? What could happen if I do it? Yeah, so pretty much those types of struggles have been a bit of an
Yeah.
obstacle in my recovery.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah, and I like what you said there about weighing up the not evidence. I'm losing the word. The reasons, justifications of, what's the cost of doing ERP and what's the cost of not doing it?
Right.
Because, yeah, ERP can be very tough. But then we kind of discussed this earlier, but then when you weigh up the option of maybe not doing it, that's even worse. And so it's, which pill do I take effectively? They're both going to be bitter, but one's going to be much, much worse than the other. Similar question then. So was there a moment in your journey where something about the treatment just made sense? You kind of understood it, or there was like a light bulb moment or anything like that?
Thankfully, I've always been very interested in like the science behind the treatment. And I remember always asking my clinicians and providers, like, can you explain this to me? Like, not in the way that you explain it to patients, but like how it actually works. Cause I was just very interested in that. And I think understanding the science behind things has always helped me. Because even with medication, I had such like a, I don't know, bad view of medication. The stigma was very overwhelming for me. But once I read up on it, on the like scientific literature and stuff, and learning how medication actually works in the brain, I was a lot more comfortable with it. And the same thing would happen with ERP and CBT and things like that. So I think I'm trying to remember when that light bulb moment happened. It might have been back when it was either in residential or back when I was in the treatment study at Columbia, when I was first in my early stages of learning about ERP, when the providers would explain it to me in more scientific terms. That really helped me understand what was going on, what was expected of me, what functional changes were going to happen in my brain. And that really almost excited me because I was like, oh, wow, there's like actual science to back this stuff. It wasn't as much a light bulb moment as there's science to back this. It's worked for other people, so it can work for me.
Yeah, I like that. Absolutely. Yeah, understanding it can take away the stigma, as you say, of medication, and just, it's less out there and more, scientific.
Yeah.
So words of hope for anyone listening.
I would definitely say, even if things seem impossible now, like completely impossible, like you'll never get better, it's definitely possible. I like to remind myself that there are so many things I've done in my treatment journey that I once thought were extremely impossible to do, but somehow is through therapy and medication, I've been able to do them. And there are still some things that I feel are impossible, but I just keep trying to remind myself, you've done the impossible before. And to anyone out there who feels like things are impossible or hopeless, you can do the impossible, even when it feels quite literally just impossible. It's very possible to overcome these things. We're a lot stronger than our OCD ever wants us to believe.
Yeah. Nice. Yeah, I like that. Good words. And then you've got a billboard. What do you want written on that billboard?
Probably, it always feels impossible until it's done. Kind of going back on what I was saying before, it can be done even when it feels impossible, kind of just going off that same sentiment.
Yeah, I like that. And then you can pick up the phone and call your 16-year-old self. What do you tell her?
That's a really good one because 16 is when I started residential treatment. I would probably say it's going to be very difficult, but you can do it. And just keep going, and it's going to be worth it.
Yeah, nice. And then lastly, anything else you wish you could have said or shared today?
I don't think so. I think I shared most things. Maybe one thing I would say is, I kind of said earlier, once your OCD becomes more manageable, other things tend to pop up that may have been masked by the OCD. Like I was saying, ADHD, and I've noticed for a lot of people that I've spoken to, once the OCD becomes more manageable, other things start to pop up, like past childhood traumas, other disorders. So if that's what's happening to you, you're not alone. And I think that hasn't been talked about enough, and it's just starting to be talked about a bit more, which I think is great. And I just want other people to know that if that's their experience, they're not alone.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, good words. Good way to end. Okay, thank you so much for sharing your story.
Thank you so much for having me. This has been a really awesome experience.
Thank you for listening to this week's podcast. If you enjoy the OCD Stories podcast and would like to support us with a one-time tip/donation, please go to theocdstories.com/support. All tips, no matter how large or small, are greatly appreciated. Please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to the podcast. And thank you to NoCD for supporting our work. If you want to find out more about NoCD, head to go.treatmyocd.com/theocdstories or click the link in the episode description. And quick disclaimer, guys, this podcast is not therapy. It is not a replacement for therapy. Please seek treatment from a trained professional. And until we speak, take care.